We're just taking a moment to just settle ourselves into this space and gather ourselves, into the space of the Gompa, into the space of the body, into this sacred space, space within, the space of the heart. So, all right. So thanks for coming along in this very hot evening. So first of all, to start with, I'd like to first of all acknowledge the Noongar Bibbulmun people, nation, who have maintained this whole area of southwest Western Australia for tens of thousands, I'm not quite sure how many tens of thousands of years, the traditional owners of this land, and particularly of this area, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and their connection to this land, their continuous connection to this land. So this sort of acknowledgement of country became actually in 1993, which was the Indigenous International Year of Indigenous Peoples. I'll come back to that word. That year, it became at all public events actually mandated to acknowledge country and to acknowledge the traditional owners. And as Australians, we have a sort of rather fractious history in this area. So I'm not going to go and give a history lesson at all. It is a space that I have worked in, and that's why it's dear to my heart. And in 1993, in that year, I was working what was then Australian Freedom from Hunger campaign, which was a project of the UN, the World Health Organization, WHO. It's a project of that worldwide. It's now been, sort of amalgamated into what's now Oxfam Australia, but at that time it was a sort of separate entity, at least for the first maybe 6 years I worked there. Anyway, a number of years. I mean, before that as well, up until then. And I mention that because, from 1990, we'd been planning for this event in 1993, the International Year of Indigenous People, bringing Indigenous people from around the world to Sydney. And actually, we had groups then going interstate as well. It was quite a huge project. It was 3 weeks in Sydney. Little did I know, I was young. But it was bringing together people who worked in the space of using theatre and performance for social change, for raising awareness for health issues and so forth. So that's, and I guess, a sort of, I was in charge of this project. And what had got me started on that was, first of all, when I was younger in Paris, I met with, or I went to workshops with Augusto Boal, and it was called Theatre of the Oppressed. And it was sort of like doing in performative arts what Paulo Freire was doing in education, and sort of reaching out to those, the poor, the illiterate, and so forth. And anyway, so there was a particular model which a lot of people in Australia were then adopting, and saying, actually, in all the Indigenous peoples throughout the world, there's all different ways of engaging community. And so that's what we did, bringing that event together. I don't want to talk at any length about that particular event, apart from the fact that it was quite profound. We brought theatre groups, not just individuals talking. And this was the nature of that work, sort of coming from more like within the Indigenous space. I remember like one of the first workshops, orientations, and we had this all these activities where you wrote things down on paper, and our Papua New Guinean friends said, "Oh, we don't use paper. You just do it. You just get out there and do it." In 1991, I was trying to remember which year it was, as part of my work, I was in the sort of national education programs, and the job I had was actually to train people using theatre in the community and in education, so schools and community in using theatre for social change. It was sort of a big thing at the time. And I went to, what happened was that we had a guy visit from, I think it was from Cape Town, maybe Cape Town in South Africa. And he basically said, you have the responsibility to do this, because we were going to this similar event, international event in Namibia. So I went there in 1991. And I went there as the Australian representative of, so what I'm doing here is I'm sort of introducing you to this topic through my own story. I can't help. But went to Namibia for this International Popular Theatre Exchange as was a time when, as the Australian representative, and my Zimbabwean friend, as soon as he saw me, says, "But you're white, what are you doing here? Where are your Aboriginal people?" And back home, of course, we had this Aboriginal committee guiding us and saying, you will be criticised, you will get this and that. So there it came. We got on really well, actually, in the end. And but it was at the time when Zimbabwe, Mugabe had just got into government. And so it was a time of hope. It was a time of hope in Namibia. They had just gained independence from South Africa. And I think for the International Year of Indigenous Peoples, it was a time of hope, and there was a profile raised and awareness raised. So we had all of these, what are they called, reconciliation groups, Reconciliation Australia groups and so forth. And so when I was with our Indigenous elders, they'd say, we don't need to be reconciled, we're reconciled. It's you, other people have to reconcile with us or with the land or whatever. And that sort of brought to mind the whole sort of basis of the ethos of Indigenous connection to land, a sense of belonging, a sense of reciprocity and interconnectedness and so forth. So at the time, one of the elders from northern New South Wales had come back. She was giving us a talk, and she'd come back from, I think it was a UN meeting where they had presented about, she was from Biable in northern New South Wales, Northern Rivers area, where it was a asbestos mining town. And so they had been lobbying for the local Indigenous community, not just for the whole community, but saying, you don't have to tell us, you know, we don't need the scientific evidence. We know the health issues that have arisen as a result of growing up on and the kids playing on these white hills of asbestos as they were growing up. Yeah. And so, yeah, so she was part of that whole lobbying, and also of lobbying against the logging in the forest up there, because, you know, there are other organisations that were involved, like the Wilderness Society and so forth, and saying it's not wilderness, you know, it's full of life. The whole of the bush is full of life. As a sort of white Anglo-Australian, anyway, so yeah, working in this space, at some level I had a discomfort, at some level I didn't, because it was like, well, I knew that all of us have a Aboriginal connection going way back. I mean, those of us who been around for, our ancestors been around for a few hundred years. And I certainly indeed knew that in my own family, that there was that sort of Aboriginal history, but I would never identify as Aboriginal because I wasn't ever raised with Aboriginal values at all. You know, I wouldn't have said that. However, my sister, who lived up in that Bundjalung area, one of the elders, she went and learnt Bundjalung because it's one of the whatever 500 or more languages that were extant in the country, or the nations across the country prior to the British arriving. Anyway, Bundjalung's intact. And so she was able to, she was going to the language, and one of the elders said to her, I can tell you where your country is, and took her to this island. So we would say, you know, if that was a Buddhist saying, you'd say, oh, they recognized her from a past life, because it certainly wasn't from this life. And when my auntie, who's my father's sister, had done this sort of research, it did indicate a connection in that area. So who knows? I mean, she doesn't know any more than that, but it did bring back to, there's no coincidences. There's no things just, it just happened. So anyway, so we organised this event in '93, the Australia Council for the Arts, it was called the Community Cultural Development Unit, and that's the area I worked in for a very long time, even after this job, and voluntarily and everything. They made it their #1 project for 1993. And even like, you know, when you're applying for funding, there's these forms and you've got to fit in certain categories and whatever. And we said, well, and so we just put in what we needed and what we needed it for. And it was, you know, one of the things was accommodation. Oh no, we don't pay for accommodation. You can't bring these people from overseas and not give them somewhere to stay. I mean, this doesn't fit. You have to change your categories. And they were open to that at that time. It was like things came together. So it was a profound coming together of people from all around the world, Indigenous peoples, who were working in their own communities, whether they were riding around on bicycles with the Dalits in India, whether they were, you know, we had people from Indonesia, people from Solomons, Vanuatu. Oh no, Vanuatu didn't come, Papua New Guinea, all through Southeast Asia. I don't think we had anyone from Africa in the end. And Indigenous people from around Australia who all engaged in this 3 weeks of dialogue, and then went out in other cities and so forth and ran programs there. And then subsequently, yeah, because I did some work. I think it was at the end of this job. It was once I'd been made redundant. The job ran out. I was working in Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, and there again with Indigenous people working on social justice issues, where the groups were theatre groups, like One Small Bag in Vanuatu, and the women's one in Solomon Islands was called Women Wearing Trousers, Girls Wearing Trousers, maybe, Women Wearing Trousers. And was their whole aim was to get equal representation of women in Parliament in Solomons, because it was even though there's matrilineal areas of the Solomons, it was very, very oppressive of women from a young age, and they wanted to address issues of abuse in their schools and the community. And it was like, are you sure you want to do that? Yes, and very, very strong determination and so forth. And so subsequently I was in Broome. I was working with the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services, whose whole health promotions unit was theatre. So it was you know, it was after Brand New Day and the second one, Corrugation Road, around that time. But some of those same people who'd been involved with that were involved with this project. And this is, they were working with prisoners and pre-release. And so we were doing some training with that. And what I got interested in, really interested in, was it was a medical services, right? And so they worked with social workers and so forth. So any of the issues that were raised up, because again, they wouldn't come and sit in a talk. You don't sit and talk, you act, you do, you exchange through your art, your dance, your story. So the story was really important, and that's what we were working with. But it connected in with the follow-up with social workers, with health workers, and a whole community approach. And what I was really interested in was, that's when I got really interested in ideas of well-being and Indigenous notions of well-being, Western notions of well-being, very, very different. And this is what I heard from the Kimberley mob, you know, that when the land is well, I'm well. When the culture's well, I'm well. And the culture reinvigorates the land, you know, and that's why, you know, your particular country is so important. And when, you know, my family's well, I'm well. When I'm well, my family's well. This sort of sense of interdependence that pervades everything. And it's a very holistic approach, very healthy holistic approach. But on the other hand, here I was working with these training these, because first of all, I said, you don't want me, you don't want a white fella. And they said, oh, yes, we do. Because I was like, why don't you get so-and-so from Central Australia? Why don't you get so-and-so from Perth? Because I'd worked with Yurayukan as well here in Perth. We'd been doing some training and stuff. And so, and they're like, oh, no, we're not getting that Perth mob, too much politics. Oh, no, you will come, you will train us, you'll leave, and then we'll do our thing with it, right? And so then I could see there's a role for me here, that I have some skills that I can share, but I'm not involved in the politics of the place, and that I'm not going to be, you know, so it made it easier for them. And so then I thought, okay, this is a role, this is space I can fill, this is a way I can be. I think Wesley Enoch, he's a well-known theatre director now, but he was just up and coming then, and he came to this 93 event, and he talked about this third space, the Indigenous space, and the, you know, sort of Western, if you like, or Anglo-Australian, if we want to say. It's a bit uncomfortable even to say that. And the third space, that meeting space in between. And so he was working at the time in the theatre and dance work that he was doing, using that, representing that, coming together, this space of coming together and sharing. And that's what, you know, has motivated me. And then, so these notions of well-being, there I was working with this theatre group, and they were like, there were dynamics between them as to, because you have all this kinship relationship, it's all very complicated, and the elders and this and that all working together. But it was also what was most obvious. I'd been used to working with community theatre and those sort of groups in Sydney, where at the end of the day, you go home. But their home was like, it was like there was no separation. So they're talking about the stories that they're presenting are their own stories, and they're the stories of their community, and it's all interconnected and interwoven. And I'm thinking, what about the well-being of these performers? You know, because that was involved as well. So, so I started doing some research in this space, and then, you know, I was working at, I was an academic coordinator of Nurigili in New South Wales Uni, which was the Aboriginal education unit. Nurigili means fireplace. And so we adopted that name. We had a whole thing about the name because the history of that place, that area, it had been a gathering place, a fire where people come together, pass on culture, pass on story and so forth. And it's also what you do in education. You come together, you share story, you pass it on. still called Narrabili today. So, so then I was working there, and I was, you know, sort of doing research about what I thought was this topic that of my research in relation to notions of well-being. And I was working there up until, well, even after I ordained. I'll come back to that. So I just wanted to just backtrack a bit, that in, I think, maybe also 93 was a big year for me. What happened in 93? After this big international event, then I needed a bit of downtime. So in those days, it wasn't like today, everybody's working from home, right? But I got to be able to work from home for a little bit. In other words, recuperate. I don't know how that worked, whether I was actually working, because I mean, I know we had computers at work. Anyway, it was a different time. And then I was asked to lead this, this was now Communicated Board, now Oxfam in Australia, lead this Indigenous tour to Central Australia. And so I did that. And just being embedded in a space that is, you are there, like when people were signing up for this trip, they'd say, is there a toilet there? I went, I don't know, I'll have to check. And then I check and they go, oh yeah, we just put in a pit latrine the other day. I go, yep, there's a toilet. Are there showers? I'll have to check. Oh, well, there is a truck road, you know, a truck drive down the road. There's a place where you can have showers. You know, people asking all these sort of, and what's our schedule? What happens at this time, this time, this time? Don't know, you just turn up. And so you're going on, it's like when I was in Vanuatu and Solomons, it was Melanesian time. When you're going in Central Australia, it's well, the elders decide, and what you're going to do, the elders decide, and you just, you know, you're there for the time. So, and you're there to have that experience. So we were there for a period of time like that. But it's that notion of respect for the land and the such connectedness to country and to land. And the concept, this is where I encountered that concept that you care for the land, you're custodians of the land, you pass the land on at least in as good a condition as you got it, if not better. So it's a very different way of regarding the land, not as a resource to be mined or extracted from. In fact, Aboriginal people in Central Australia knew about uranium and knew to leave it there. They said it's the big poison. We don't touch it, you know, for tens of thousands of years. Anyway, that's past history. But that concept is very different. And so like at Uluru, with the idea you don't climb. And all through this trip that I was leading, that message was getting across to people. Well, we thought it was getting across, the people on the tour, don't climb, don't climb. It's like walking over somebody's temple, mosque, sacred space and so forth. There's history there that I think Wim Wenders, when one of the film he put out, and State of Things, I think it was, and he had flown over Uluru and he'd taken shots of what was sort of private business. Indigenous private, and that shouldn't have shown. So he got I don't know if he got fined or he got wrapped over the knuckles, and German filmmaker. And anyway, so the respect is palpable, and part of the reason of that, in that, you know, it's the heart of the nation. You know, we've got the what is it, the coming from the heart, the Uluru Statement, from the heart of the nation. And it has a lot of symbolism in our history in terms of handing back land and so forth, in Gough Whitlam's time. But yeah, not to walk. And yet this one guy, and he was an eco-tourism operator, and he just said, I just got to walk. I've just got to, you know, conquer. I mean, it's like Lama Zopa Rinpoche's people are attracted to these places that there's high energy, spiritual energy, and they don't realize why they're attracted. They're sacred places, and so they're attracted. And then with our mindset, it's sort of like you've got to conquer it, you've got to climb it, and whatever. But that, you know, we know, pay our respects. So, yeah, so the idea of not climbing is because also as custodians, and this is where Aboriginal people have such generosity of spirit, you know, that with this, the Mutijulu people of that area are like, we're responsible for everybody on the land. So if someone breaks a leg, has a heart attack, it's like we haven't held up our responsibility as custodians of the land. So you can see where that mindset is such a very caring, generous, open to everybody. And so I think, you know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama went there, was it 2016, was it? Yeah, I know I'd planned to go, and then Lama Zopa Rinpoche's schedule changed. So at that time he was at Vajrayana Institute, so I couldn't go. Did you go?
2015.
Yeah, 2015 you went? To, I don't know, where, did you go?
Only because he came here that year as well.
Yeah, and His Holiness, because the previous trip he'd been to Australia, when they'd gone up to Darwin, they'd flown down over Uluru. They'd made sure the plane could fly down, and one of the guy who was the photographer on the trip explained the history of the place to His Holiness. He says, "I'm going there next time," and then he announced it on Living Black, and you know, these other Indigenous shows are just like, I guess His Holiness is going there next time. We're going to make it happen. Because again, you know, sort of wanting to meet with the Indigenous people of the land, having that motivation. So, you know, we do have this. It's I don't have people been to Uluru? Yeah, very powerful place.
I actually climbed Uluru in 1974.
Well, in 74, people didn't have that awareness, you know. And people have the T-shirts, I climbed the rock and all of that sort of thing. Yeah. Yes,
And you were allowed to then.
yeah, you were allowed to then. It's what people did, right? And so now there's more awareness and more understanding of why that is. And so we do have this connection. I mean, sometimes we see that connection of, you know, we say that there's maybe some, I don't know if there's any connection with Buddhism at all. Sometimes it's posited that maybe there is and maybe there isn't, but it is a power place. You know, it's definitely a very powerful place, right? Incredibly, I was bowled over going there. It really is very, very strong place. And I think the second time I went there, I decided to pay my respects to the land by, you have to do this early in the morning because it gets hot like it, circumambulating around for a few hours. But it sort of felt good to sort of pay respects in a way that was meaningful and to circumambulate. I mean, we would circumambulate, if we could, Mount Kailash or any of these other holy sacred places. So, yeah. And okay, so then I was, you know, sort of teaching in Nuragili for some time. And one of the things I came across, our office was based in the basement of the library building. It's that now they've got the beautiful building that we'd always have visualized having a big round circular building. Oh, and I should say at that time in education, it was almost on the tip of my tongue again, who was the Minister of Education nationally, Brendan. Yeah, anyway. Brendan Nelson. He made this, he issued this, shall we say, challenge to the universities to teach all students Indigenous studies, Indigenous Australian studies. So you can imagine my life was pretty busy. That's the ones I was teaching. And we had exchange students from America and so forth. So we were very much on a mission to make sure that was at least students did at least one unit in that. Anyway, so then, okay, so then it came up that, yeah, so this book. So there were a couple of things that happened. this book, Aboriginal Gift, called Aboriginal Gift. And this is now the area that I'm really interested in. And it was by a guy, I forget his first name, Stockton. He lives up in the Blue Mountains these days. He's a Christian. And he talks about the Aboriginal gift being this quality of deep listening, listening to the land, connecting and so forth, Aboriginal connection and healing and so forth, which then I subsequently met Miriam Ungimir Bauman, who works very much the Didiri. And so that's why become quite a focus for me. And also I started, you know, students would turn up to teach and say, oh, have you met so-and-so? And so my sort of great mentor passed away 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, Auntie Joan at Quandamooka, Stradbroke, North Stradbroke Island, just near Brisbane. And she took me out on some of these practices and so forth, and gave me some guidance who to read and research. And we had a sort of quite a profound connection, which I have to say, when I had started doing research in this area, and I was very aware of the ethics of what white people in this research space and what had happened historically and so forth, and this whole bunch of procedures around that. And so I developed a model, I can't remember what the model was, cross-cultural research model for working with Indigenous Australians as part of the course at, I think that was at Western Sydney Uni. Yeah, anyway, so then I started thinking, aha, this is what I'm interested in. And it has got more and more refined, this idea of the deep listening and healing, and it connects with our meditation practices, deep meditation practices. Maybe not all our meditation practices, but deep meditation. And as part of this research too, I'd been introduced to, a friend of mine had given me an article that has now become, or at least that person and the concepts there has now become quite central in this engagement. And it was about, anyway, this guy had been working in Central Australia, a researcher, and he wrote about Indigenous worldview and ethics and so forth, and points of connection of that with Tibetan Buddhism. And I thought, this is my guy. This is my guy. It took me quite a few years longer to find him, locate him, I did. Anyway, so before that, I'll just pause there. I'm trying to do this chronologically. So meantime, I ordained with Lama Zopa Rinpoche in New Zealand. And I thought, well, there goes that career. I won't be doing that anymore. And I still had a qualm. Do I continue on in this research or do I not? What do I do? And I wrote to Rinpoche. Actually, I gave Rinpoche a letter at my ordination, didn't hear a thing. And they say, when you don't hear back, keep doing what you're doing. And then about a year later, I was really, really like, do I just abandon this? Do I do this, do that? And so I had come to the conclusion, I'm not going to be needing, I'd been angsting over it. And then I came to this conclusion, it's okay, I can work it out for myself. I did write to Rinpoche and ask the question. And then I thought, no, I don't need to be doing this research. Here I am at this stage. I wasn't still working at the uni. I was full-time in the Dharma Centre. And anyway, so because I had written to Rinpoche, and then Venerable Holly at one point said, is your question still relevant? And at first I said yes, because that was my pride. And then I thought, that's just your pride. You've worked it out. And so I wrote back and said, no, it's okay, I've worked it out. And she said, well, interesting, here's Rinpoche's response. And it was totally opposite to what I had come to the conclusion I'd see. If you come to the right decision, keep doing what you're doing, but if you come to the wrong decision, boom. So it came quickly. And it was very clear to continue on. And Rinpoche said, think of the benefit for human beings. So that resonated with me, because before I ever started doing this research project, I had thought to myself, I want to do something that's going to be a benefit, that's not going to sit on some university shelves. And because part of it was tied up with getting a PhD. Here I was an academic and I'd got to the top of that lecture grade or whatever, and I needed to be enrolled in a PhD to keep going. You know, all of these things when you're being an academic. But I thought, I don't need that now. Anyway, so of course the answer came back loud and clear. And so I do feel this ongoing necessity to do that. I mean, it's the Lama's instruction. And this gentleman who I had got that article of one time, because I was going to America quite frequently around that time. It might have been 2016 when I met him. Actually, I think it was. I think it was kind of this guy. I met him. It was at the Lamp of the, no, it wasn't at the Lamp of the Path retreat. I was going to America for the Lamp of the Path retreat in North Carolina, and I somehow had tracked down an email for him. You know, the years in between, tracked down, because before, when I was doing searches early on, his name didn't come up at all. But here I found it, and I found an email, and it was at the University of Oregon in, I think it's Lincoln, Oregon. I thought, oh, that's a cool place. They're all environmentally friendly and I really want to go there. Of course, he wasn't there. He wrote back and said, well, I'm at Sarah J Monastery at the moment. And so he's a Tibetologist. He was doing research at Sarah J. He might be still there. But I said, well, I'm going to be in America, blah, blah, blah. And we ended up, he said, well, I'm going to be in San Diego on these dates, and it happened to coincide. So we coordinated our trip to arrive on the same morning. And then Kamalekshi Somo, who's a very well respected nun, also an academic, and she came and picked us up. And because anyway, so she was the one responsible for setting up the Jamyang Foundation in Dharamsala, where for the nuns to train as geshis. And so there's like so many geshimas. The ones who travelled here were connected with the Jamyang Foundation in Dharamsala, because she saw in the 80s that, you know, they weren't getting the same level of education. Anyway, so she also, even though she's from San Diego, she was living somewhere else at the time, but it all coordinated, coalesced, and we came together. And then we were having lunch, and he had said, before you come, read this, and then we'll discuss. And got there, and I was, well, both a bit, well, me in particular, a bit jet lagged. Oh, no, I shouldn't have been jet lagged. But we met up, and it was Kamalekshi Saro said, what you're talking about is silence. And I thought, that's precisely what I'm talking about, silence, it's a great silence. So this has become that, because if I look at even that concept of silence in the Indigenous space, silence is not a voidness. You know, talk about there is a comfort with silence. Actually, probably in here, there's probably some quotes on that. That it's a mark of respect. It's not an absence, you know. Silence is not an absence, it's a very full space. So it's a very, very different connection. And the fact that, you know, in many, many Indigenous programs, that young people, when they're struggling on drugs and this and that, you know, that people take them to the country and take them to the bush. And this is their healing. And to be in the bush, you know, not with all these devices, and to be there and to learn their culture and connect with their culture. And that has had in Central Australia, amongst the Wiradjuri's, like almost the whole of Western New South Wales, similar sorts of programs, and have been quite interesting connections. Anyway, so so here was I thinking, oh, should I continue to do this? Now, before I had to leave that retreat early to meet with this guy, and we were having a lunch with llamas of Rinpoche with Sangha. And I ended up sitting directly opposite Rinpoche. I can only say, when you're having lunch, it's the most nervous place to be sitting. However, I got to have a bit of conversation. And part of that was that, because I'd already had a time with Rinpoche, an interview where I was sort of checking, is this still relevant for me to be doing? Because one of my teachers had indicated, you know, karma changes, maybe it's not still relevant. And then, so I was sort of checking in with Rinpoche and said, oh, I'm going to go and meet so-and-so, this guy. And Rinpoche didn't say a word. He didn't say a word. And then I go and meet him at the airport, and he pulls out this book and he hands me a copy, like he'd just come from India. He had literally just flown in from India, and he had a battered old suitcase, and he goes, hold on a minute, and he throws everything around the airport. He says, I've got this book for you. And Practical Buddhism, it's called. And he said, it's the only book I've ever written that you can actually read. Because, you know, he's very academic, so it's got all the ibids and opposites and all of this every few words. Anyway, so that, yeah, so, and then, because I told him, I mentioned to Rinpoche this, because what happened when I had tracked him down with his email, I'd emailed him and said, explain myself. I don't know if you know who I am. Well, no, I didn't say, I don't know if you, I knew he didn't know who I was. I said, this might be coming out of the blue, and it certainly was. But, you know, I'm a Buddhist nun. I was ordained by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I've been, you know, and he's advised me to do this research, and I read this article of yours, and I've read, you know, some of his books about methodology, so forth. And I got a pretty quick email back. Well, that's very interesting. Because I knew nothing much about him. He says, well, that's very interesting. Lama Yeshe's my guru. I met the Lamas in New Zealand in 1970, whatever it was, because that was when he was in Central Australia as well. I'm at Sarah, I'm doing this research, and I'm like, okay then, clearly we've been put together, right? So from both sides. And then when I met him at the airport, he said, you know, I saw Rinpoche in December and gave him a draft of this book. He never mentioned this either, you know, so it's sort of like Rinpoche sort of makes the connections, and then it's done, and, you know, hands off, over to you, do what you do with that. So it seems to be, yeah, seems to be a thing for me to do. And so then I'll just bring you up to speed of this week. So I grew up in and around Newcastle. And when I was growing up, I knew there were Aboriginal people around vaguely, but vaguely was about it. And of course, much later when I started working with Indigenous people, I was indeed working with the Awabakal Nation, with people from that, and we were doing training together. I think we're doing cross-cultural training for police or something like that. I don't seem to remember. It's a long time ago. Anyway, so just recently, I heard this gentleman being interviewed on the radio, so I got very excited. This week I got this book, The Dreaming Path. And so he's an Indigenous elder who, he's coming from his space of healing. He's also an academic, his space of healing. And this whole thing is, it's like an offering to the whole of Australia, an offering to the whole world, actually, of what can be offered from an Indigenous perspective in terms of us healing ourselves individually, our community, our culture, the land, absolutely everything. And it just is quite profound. It's called The Dreaming Path, Indigenous Thinking to Change Your Life. So I just wanted to read just a couple of little things. I've been going through and underlining absolutely everything. And then I'll go back and revise that. Okay, so now just his opening. It's just so beautiful. And this is the thing, you know, I read Aboriginal writers and, you know, I'm talking about poets and so forth, that it just resonates with the land. The ancient spirits are all around us. They awaken from their slumbers when someone is willing to listen. They have many messages. To hear them, the students must be quiet in mind, body, and spirit. For profound truth does not need to be yelled. In the sacred space of quiet whispers, reflection can take place and the earth breathes more easily. And then he goes on, because he was one of these CEOs, high flyers, and, you know, did all of these things. And then, yeah, so then he talks about going from that space to reconnecting with country and his culture. And he says, the old spirit looked at me with eyes of wisdom, love, and sadness. Why are you all so busy but doing so little? Why do you try so hard to get things you don't really need? Why do you see happiness as such a hard thing to achieve? Why can't you be content with what you have been given? What you really need is all around you, but you don't see it. You have all lost your way. You've forgotten who you are. You are not living your truth. You still have time to remember. You need to remember. You need to reconnect. If you don't remember, if you don't reconnect, you will have failed us, and things that are important will be gone. We will be gone. Everything will be gone and lost forever. So there's a sense of urgency in that as well. So when I was working at Nurigili, one of the young Aboriginal students, because this was after I'd ordained, because otherwise we wouldn't have had this conversation. So after I still worked there a short period of time. I cut back my hours to just a couple of days a week, as she said, it's okay, a couple of days a week. But I really, you know, I was planning my exit. But anyway, so this young Aboriginal woman, and she came up at one event and she said, oh, so are you Gelugpa or Kagyu? So I went, oh, so you know something about Tibetan Buddhism. And of course she was showing me that she did. And I said, oh, how did you engage? How did you learn about that? And she was from the Central Coast. And she said, because she was seeking spirituality, and she said, my spiritual connections have gone, you know, like in terms of a living culture in her area. And she said, Buddhism is the closest I've come to that. And so this is really interesting that it is a sense of reciprocal engagement. And I'm very interested in because you know, when I started out with this research, and it started off about well-being, and then it was like, okay, what's the world view of Indigenous people? What's the world view of Tibetan Buddhists? Because this guy, this researcher, you know, who I connected with, and he was talking about how they're very much both oral traditions. People are passed, you know, the lineage is passed on through oral traditions, and there's something profound in that. Deep listening, really. And like my Aboriginal friends, like I might forget them, they don't forget me, you know, they don't forget, right? It's like incredible. And a sense of when I was in, you know, part of that trip in Central Australia, and the guy who was leading us around in Alice Springs, he was a linguist at the Institute for Aboriginal Development. I don't know if that's still there, but at the time. And he'd be going around, you know, with a t-shirt on, which was fine during the daytime, but the temperatures got really cold at night. And I'm like, how can you do that? Just go around in a t-shirt. And he goes, oh, mind over matter. Like, what's your problem? I was like, yeah, but we work at that, mind over matter. And he's just got it, you know. So very, very, interesting points. So I just, yeah, maybe read a couple more things from Paul Callahan. Because I guess one of the other things in Central Australia I found, was going around with the women elders. And it made me realise how disconnected from the land we can be. That, you know, they'd be, we'd go out and they'd tap on the ground, like they have their stick like this, tapping on the ground, and go dig there. And so you dig there. And it was the roots of the acacia. And they could hear, without having their ear on the ground, that is where you dig, because they could feel the resonance of that's where the rotten roots are. And where rotten roots are, there's food. They come in the form of witchy grubs. Okay. There. So the sort of auditory acuity and visual acuity, you know, say, oh, stop the bus, there's berries on that bush. And you go, where's the bush? You know, quite profound, and just show us how much we're disconnected, you know, from what we're capable of, really. And, you know, in this book, this is what this guy's saying, you know, we're willing to share this with anybody who wants to listen, anyone who wants to listen, you know, that share the stories. That was the whole intention. That methods, he said, you know, I know I have to read you the imagine. Okay. I would like you all to imagine a world with no war, no crime, no homelessness, no hunger, no poverty. A world where every person has all they need to live a long life of fulfillment and well-being. A world with many languages, but where there is no word for hate, because hate does not exist. And then he says, do you think that kind of world can truly exist? Most people would say no, but that utopia described is how Aboriginal people lived for a very, very long time. So we're talking about climate change and so forth. There are many, many climate changes that happened during those tens of thousands of years, ice age, whatever, you know. Yet there were, yes, there were instances of disagreement and anger, but because of the system of rules and obligations in traditional Aboriginal society meant, you know, it created a way of life based on traditional values, ways of thinking and practices that we need to learn from now. He's saying the world needs this now. We need this now. So yeah, okay. So this is what I wanted to just share and introduce. Yeah, there's so much in here, and I put so many quotes down, but so little time. Anyway, so I just wanted to share by way of my journey to here, and I'm personally hoping, like in to be able to go to, I've been yearning to go to Central Australia to sit with Miriam Ungamir. We had a trip organised for 2020. That didn't happen. So let's just see what happens. It might happen in the future, but it doesn't have to be with her, but it would be good. You know, to sort of continue this sense of connection. When I did actually indeed meet Miriam Ungamir Bauman, it was together with Sir Lawrence, Father Lawrence Freeman, who revived the world Christian meditation movement as a, I want to say, is he Benedictine monk? Anyway, he said because, you know, I went with a Korean nun friend, and we're both hoping to go to Central Australia to one of these retreats together. She's very interested in this area as well. She lives in Sydney these days. Anyway, so he he came up and introduced himself, which didn't need any introduction. But he said, you know, the reason that he became, that he ordained was to meditate. That was the reason he ordained. And so that's coming from a Christian tradition where he's revived the Christian meditation movement. So, and this is what I found from Auntie Joan. She came from that Christian background. She introduced me to another sort of Italian Christian meditator and so forth. I had been, when I did I was in Phuket some years ago, 2012, doing with Alan Wallace, Eve McMahon, and Poet, and the Cultivating Emotional Balance teacher training, like Kirsty's done and so forth. And one of my fellow participants there introduced me to an American nun, or her work, Sister Margaret Funk, Meg Funk. And so that sort of got me very interested in, well, what were the practices of the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers as well? Because it's you can't say one size fits all, but that it's there in all cultures, it's there in all traditions, that sense of deep connectedness, you know. And it seems to me, the more I go on in my Buddhist understanding, as tiny as it is, the more it seems that it's at such a subtle energetic level. There are so many deep connections, and that is our space of healing. So I just wanted to introduce like that tonight. That's it from me. Does anyone want to ask any questions or make any comments?
Are there any programs happening in set up to program Aboriginals? We see
yeah, I mean, I haven't researched what sort of programs are here.
Yeah.
There will be programs. When I was, because I was like, oh, I don't even know who the Indigenous people of this. I know Noongar, of course. That's, you know, that wasn't. So I was sort of looking up of this particular area, because I know, like at Chenrezig Institute, when we have our pujas at least, and sometimes with the retreats, we pay our respects to the Gubbi Gubbi people, the local Indigenous people, and so forth. So just to keep that awareness that they, you know, Indigenous people have held this land through all sorts of transformations in the earth, in the weather, and so forth, over tens of thousands and thousands of years, so that we can be here and share this space, you know. So that, and yeah, and yes, we have nonetheless, because people have been moved away from culture, off their land, and all of this. There's such there are so many social issues that weren't there traditionally. And yeah, the drinking thing is interesting, because I just have to say, statistically, it's a very small percentage of Aboriginal people who drink, but the ones who drink to get drunk. They don't drink socially, and that was partly they were banned from doing that. They were banned from hotel, you know, for a long time. But so it's interesting why people do what they do. So they, yeah, it's sort of like a smaller percentage overall, but the ones, and because when you see Aboriginal people drunk, it's in a public place.
The actual sniffing.
Oh yeah, all of that. And this is where the elders were able to take people to country. But here there would be programs. I haven't been able to connect with yet.
Actually, I heard yesterday that they've got all that problem in Broome at the moment.
Yeah.
Indigenous. And what they're going to do is they're not going to put them in jail. They're going to send them out country.
It works. You know, reconnecting with country works.
Missing. They don't understand. Yeah. They may have been brought up in the white man's world. They don't realise that their inner self is missing country.
It is the inner self. It's the inner self that needs healing.
Yeah, it's their culture that they don't even understand themselves.
That's correct.
Until they actually reconnect.
No, I mean, so many of these problems, particularly with young programs, particularly with young people, it was sort of like they didn't have a sense of identity, particularly the males, because the women were better able to transition into changing their roles. than the males. So historically, the hunters and so forth. So the role, it was, and they lost their rites of passage. And so, and in fact, not to do with Indigenous, but we had one of the film directors, he did Hoop Dreams, but he at VI, he worked with the post-release prisoners and the blokes and said, I don't know what you're doing, but he ran these workshops for young men about rites of passage because they've been lost in our culture as well. So, and we look at that when we were at that event in '93, those of us from a Celtic background, there's all of this is in the Celtic tradition, but it's gone. And now we see the same, yeah. So, yeah, I'm happy to investigate or be told what's around because.
I mean, I lived in Uluru and also spent 3 months in Llama
Yeah.
as a nurse.
Yeah.
And also I did find that up in Broome as well, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm heartened to hear these stories because what I do is told to kids.
Yeah. You're dealing with the emergency situations.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to sort out things like I'm 7 and I'm giving staff housing, smashed the windows, pulled floorboards up, took the doors off, and the class in the middle.
Yeah. So there's a lot of cultural and social. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of cultural and social issues.
They in Marble Bar don't see that.
Yeah.
You know, and then of course they've been.
I think at the moment, like we've had the because the Northern Territory are having their elections and they're talking about how disastrous the intervention was because there were very, very good programs on the ground run by Aboriginal people that knew their people that, and they were working, and then that all got defunded, and then it was like we're going to fly in to the rescue, you know, the big intervention.
People
who don't understand and don't work with. There's so many stories, like, you know, the one group that was running the local school bus, and they were picking up, the community was running the school bus, and they were picking up the kids all around the 80-kilometre radius to get to school every day. And then that was contracted out, put out to tender, and someone else got it. And because the community would have that tender, with that they built school buildings, community halls, they put it back into the community, and then it was put out to some company, and then all the families just boycotted it because nobody wanted, because their community one had been undercut. And so their bus stood there, the kids weren't getting to school. So it wasn't working with the community, and that can happen too.
People who have no background.
Have no background,
They've
yeah.
got the university degrees and
But
all
yeah,
that,
yeah.
but no knowledge.
Yeah. And it is a thing of listening. I mean, the first thing that Aboriginal people do, you've got to sit down and listen. And it takes a long time to build the relationship to get to a point of knowing what to do.
Actually, this morning, I heard on a Friday morning, they interview a woman or somebody who's a pillar of the community. And this woman's been working in Aboriginal health for 15 years. And she was saying what they set up 15 years ago, they still do, is that, and I never knew that, she said 70% of the Indigenous prisoners are deaf. The kids go to school, they're already deaf because the nutrition they're not getting. Yeah. So they're now teaching them to grow food. Yeah. They've been doing it for 15 years. Yeah. And as she said, like in Perth at the moment, the shelves are empty. The shelves up there are not only empty, they're nothing there. She said, but they live on noodles and Coke. Mm. It's great for diabetes, yes, exactly, disease, and deafness in children, which I never knew. What is it? I'll find out her name. Actually, very interesting. Yeah, because it was. I mean, if we look at historically, that Aboriginal people, if you look at, yeah, you look at when. Okay, we're going back a long way. Captain Cook came, and the descriptions they had, Aboriginal people were healthy, yes, incredibly healthy.
And first of all, smallpox, and that wiped a whole lot of people out. But then introducing, and particularly in the sort of Northern Territory in those areas, what did they get fed? Sugar and white flour.
That's right.
No wonder diabetes, no wonder all these
And
other,
kidney disease.
yeah,
So many of them on dialysis.
Dialysis,
That bus that goes
Yep,
around the
yep,
Northern
yep,
Territory
yep.
with dialysis.
So, you know, and you know, there, of course, a lot of the, and because of the overgrazing and cutting down of trees and everything else, a lot of the Indigenous berries and so forth, they don't grow like they did before. So Aboriginal people had to be re-educated that where they moved around on the land, they, you know, that the reason they were nomadic and only within a certain area, not a huge area, was to allow the land to replenish. And then they just got told, you can't keep doing that because the land's not replenishing anymore. Well, because the culture has changed and the land has changed. And, building fences. Yeah, and there's a fence there.
A friend of mine here with the Indigenous lady, she makes a lot of bush medicines.
Yeah.
And in fact, she's on television because she makes this arthritis cream, which is pretty, I've got some. But she also has written a book on bush medicine.
Yeah, yeah.
Edith Cat with a chap from UWR.
Yeah.
And gives, you know, and she goes around teaching other Aboriginal women about the plants.
Exactly.
That are edible and plants you can do things.
Well, this
with.
is.
She does a great job there, and I've known her for many
And
years.
yeah, I mean, we had that in when I was moving up to Queensland, and one of the students at Vajrayana Institute, and so she hooked me up with this woman who's further up in Queensland. And I thought, oh, they won't have anything to do with this mob here, but they do. They exchange all that knowledge between the different groups, you know.
Right,
So,
it's quite,
yeah,
yeah, this stuff is really
And,
nice
yeah.
to see a lot of the stuff that she does.
yeah.
And it's got very interesting. Extremely.
Well, one good thing we got out of Port Hedley was that Australia Station,
Yeah,
there was a guy called Snow, who was Aboriginal and white.
yes, I do.
We managed to
Just like
get
everyone else.
him to stop the alcohol
Yeah.
going into the station.
Yeah,
where the
Fantastic.
Indigenous were.
fantastic.
That was one thing we managed to do.
Well, it's great that women sat outside.
But-
The women who stopped the alcohol going.
Oh
And
yeah,
we
in many
went-
places, like
I love that. That was a
This
great
was
story.
No,
the old
in
station.
where is it? Somewhere in Northern Territory where when it's you know, pension day,
Yeah.
the women leave.
Yeah.
The women and kids leave and they come back 2 days later when the guys have sobered up a bit. Basically.
So much violence.
Yeah.
You know, domestic violence.
Yeah.
And sexual abuse.
Lots of issues.
Horrible, horrible stuff.
And it's not the only place where those issues
Of
are.
course not.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, Marble Brothers.
Yeah.
Well, Beagle Bay.
Oh,
Yeah, no, Beagle Bay.
Yeah.
Say no more. I know, because when I was working up that way, I didn't go to Beagle Bay, but the group kept talking to me about Beagle Bay and Beagle Bay and all that. Okay, I never got to that one.
They're Christian. Church.
Well, there's all other history there
Yeah,
too.
Another.
I think it's sort of like with modern medicine, they're finding they talk about this epigenetics of trauma.
Yes.
So look at the history of
Yeah.
this country.
Yeah, I think Judy Atkinson, the trauma trails, talking about intergenerational trauma, and it absolutely is true.
That's really kind
Yeah.
of growing exponentially now.
In the white people, so everywhere.
And also the health issues that, you know, like, I just thought to be an Aboriginal male in Moree in New South Wales and know that your life expectancy is 37 or 38 doesn't mean you won't live longer, but that you don't expect to live longer than that. And that when you go for health treatment, it's not just one thing you're presenting with, you've got a whole cocktail of illnesses. So it's a very, very different set of challenges.
And their
Yeah.
age is well below white people.
Oh, everything is, yeah, everything. Okay, folks,
Very interesting. Thank you.
it is interesting. So,
Extremely interesting.
I mean, I hope you're interested, well, you're here. And And they're things I'm passionate about that I'm going to be talking about. I don't know any other way to go. But I've just been, like, since I got this the other day, I've just been, oh, what's next? I was very excited.
Kid with a new toy.
Kid with a new toy. Well, I'd been waiting for it to come out and, you know.
It only was February 2022, I saw it actually.
Yeah.
Come out.
February 22. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think also having kind of an acknowledgement of the country, I think that must be kind of the first time maybe at High River.
Well, I think we need to do more acknowledgement of country.
When we had Lindy, I know John did it.
Yeah. Because I think it just, anything that just sort of keeps that awareness that actually, and I guess this is the thing that was really the way we worked in overseas aid programs, was don't look at the deficit, don't look at it from a deficit model, look at it from an asset model. And look always, what are the resources within a community, not what, I mean, you've got to address what's not working, but that it is the thing of first sit down and listen and actually do it the way the people say, you know.
I remember many years ago, I was touring Jimmy Little.
Oh, yeah.
And she stayed in my home also.
Yeah, his sister was a dear, dear
we
friend
went
of
out
mine.
to the
Betty.
Indigenous
Yeah.
music school
Yeah.
out in Clontarf. And I'm listening to him talking to the Indigenous. And I heard him say, what you need to do, boys and girls, he said, is live on white man's time. And I'm thinking to myself, what's he on about, right? What's he talking about, white man's time? Time's the same for everybody. Anyway, we got back in the car, we're driving on. And I said, Jimmy, what was that white man's time? Oh, he said black fella time. That's so different to white.
Oh,
man's time.
totally.
And I what I heard was white fella time. I didn't put the black fella time because there's no such time as black fella time.
Yeah.
But for them to be musicians and
Yeah.
need to learn white fella time.
No, it's,
And it was like,
yeah.
oh, hello.
yeah, so many cultural things. Actually,
Yeah.
Llama Zopa Rinpoche's talked like that. Sort
Yeah.
of like, oh, because here I am in America, so I know I have to have a break at this time because that's how you do things in America. Like, for example,
That's
you know,
right, yeah.
not, you know, not
Yeah.
that's how we do it. As we know, Llama Zopa Rinpoche can
Yeah,
lose
yeah.
a sense of time. Geshe Dawa was like that. You say, well, maybe we have a tea break, and then we say, Geshe, it's 2 p.m. Do you think we could have a lunch break? Yeah. So time is,
Yeah, but it was when
it's a
music
relative.
white fella time, I got there. Took it there.
And actually, just before I was reading this, and I'm still reading as well, Goromal, you know, a friend of mine, if I could just maybe just mention this, a friend of mine in Queensland who I'd sort of, I knew she was around. We were connected through some other professional work we'd done in the past many years ago. And I couldn't track her down, and then a mutual friend tracked her down. And so I met up with her last year, and she's got about 18 months to live. And I wasn't talking to her about that previous work because it was a body therapy, and she doesn't want to focus on the body because her body's failing her. But when I came here, got sent a book of hers and saying, and you have to read it. Because I'd been talking to her about this research, and I sort of feel like I want to dedicate to her. Anyway, so I got the book of Goromal, the biography of Goromal. So, and again, it's the musicians, and you look at, it's quite a profound, deep worldview. I mean, there's still all the music industry stuff. I skipped through those pages, and then, but profound worldview. We have so much to learn. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming. And yeah, that's it. I'll turn this off.